I moved my fingers across the array of vials, each one meticulously labeled, each containing a unique protein sample harvested from the depths of Triton. Organizing them always brought a sense of calm, a counterpoint to the chaos that lurked beyond the reinforced polymer walls of my quarters. Outpost Kepler, an example of human innovation and corporate exploitation. A pimple on the icy face of this desolate moon. Vanguard Interstellar, always eager to sink their claws into the next frontier, had spared no expense in establishing this remote research facility. They envisioned Triton as the next frontier for resource exploitation, and of course, scientific discovery. But mostly exploitation. Not that I cared much about their motives. Their money had resurrected my research. I paused, a vial of phosphorescent green liquid catching the light. Funny how life, or at least the potential for it, could exist in such a hostile environment. It was the extremophiles that drew me here. The organisms that thrived in conditions that would obliterate most terrestrial life. My life's work, understanding the building blocks of life pushed to its very limits. A work that had stalled, hit a brick wall, until Vanguard came along. Before that, it was just endless simulations, grant applications, and the haunting memory of my father. His mind, once so sharp, so brilliant, had been eroded by a degenerative neurological disease, a cruel irony for a man who had dedicated his life to unraveling the mysteries of the human brain. He had been a pioneer in neural implant technology, a field that was now commonplace. Now, everyone had an implant, used for everything from communication to entertainment to data analysis. His work had paved the way, but in the end, it hadn't saved him. I saw him fade away, his brilliance extinguished piece by piece until only a hollow shell remained. That was the genesis of my drive, my obsession, to conquer these diseases, to unlock the secrets of the brain, and to ensure that no one else had to suffer the same fate. It was also what made me reckless, willing to gamble on an offer from a corporation like Vanguard, to go to the edge of the solar system chasing ghosts, or in this case, alien fungus. Triton, a frozen wasteland orbiting Neptune, a world of perpetual twilight and bone-chilling cold. Temperatures here plummeted to minus 235 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze nitrogen. If it weren't for our environmental suits and the outpost's geothermal power plant, we'd be popsicles in seconds. I tapped my temple, a familiar gesture, activating my neural implant's internal log. The crew manifest flickered into view in my mind's eye, each a specialist in their respective fields, each driven by their own demons and ambitions. Dr. Morris, the robotics expert, a whiz with anything mechanical. Then there was Dr. Grant, our chief medical officer, a steady presence in this chaotic environment. Dr. Kent, head of security, a stoic man of few words, responsible for keeping us safe, an increasingly difficult task. Lastly, there was Dr. Reed, a fellow xenobiologist. He shared my fascination with extremophiles, though his enthusiasm sometimes bordered on recklessness. He'd been unusually quiet these last few days. My implant reminded me of the ongoing communication blackout. Interference from solar activity, they said. Convenient. It cut us off from Earth, leaving us truly alone out here. Vanguard was probably having a fit. They like to keep close tabs on their investments. I brought up the most recent research log. The Black Bloom. That's what we'd named the alien fungus found buried deep in the permafrost. A network of black veins that thrived in the extreme cold. Initial tests were promising. The bloom exhibited a unique ability to interface with our neural implants, a potential breakthrough in treating neurological disorders. It was the discovery of a lifetime, or so we thought. I added an addendum to the log. Preliminary findings suggest a symbiotic relationship between the bloom and neural tissue. Further investigation is required, especially to determine why Reed is avoiding me. A sudden chime from my implant jolted me from my work. It was Morris, his voice urgent. "Arthur, get to the lab, it's Reed." I grabbed my sidearm, a pulse pistol issued to all personnel, and hurried out of my quarters. The lab was a scene of chaos. Dr. Reed was strapped to a medical table, his body convulsing violently. His eyes, normally a warm brown, were now completely black, devoid of any life or recognition. Black, vein-like lines surged beneath his skin, spreading outward from the implant access point on his temple. It looked like a bad tattoo, moving, expanding, devouring. "His vitals are all over the place," Dr. Grant said. "Neural activity is through the roof. It's like something is rewriting his brain." I approached the table, my focus on the grotesque display. The bloom. It had to be. "What happened?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. "He collapsed while examining the bloom sample," Morris explained, his voice trembling slightly. "One minute he was fine, the next, this." He gestured towards Reed, who let out a guttural roar, his body arching. He fought against the restraints, and with a crack he ripped one of the metal restraints from the table. It was as if he had the strength of 10 men. Reed, now fully under the bloom's influence, rushed toward Dr. Grant. Morris, reacting instinctively, fired his pulse rifle. The blue energy beam struck Reed in the chest, but it seemed to have little effect. He didn't even flinch. "Activate a sonic emitter," I ordered, remembering the initial tests on the bloom's cellular structure. "High-frequency sound waves should disrupt it." Morris fumbled with his belt, retrieving a small handheld device. He activated it, and a piercing, high-pitched tone filled the lab. Reed recoiled, clutching his head, but the effect was temporary. The black marks on his body moved, and a low-frequency sound emanated from him, interfering with the emitter's effectiveness. The device in Morris's hand flickered and died. At that moment, Dr. Kent and another security officer, Hunter, burst into the lab, their pulse rifles raised. Together, the four of us managed to restrain Reed, but it was a brutal struggle. It took all four of us to wrestle the infected man to the floor. He fought with inhuman strength, his body contorting. Finally, using magnetic clamps from a nearby workstation, we managed to secure him to the floor. Dr. Grant was on the floor, clutching his head. He'd hit it on the corner of a table during the struggle. "Get him to the medical bay," I said to Kent and Hunter. "And be careful, he might be infected." Both men looked uneasy but followed the order. They each grabbed one of Grant's arms and half-carried, half-dragged him from the lab. I contacted the rest of the crew via the implant comms. "We have a situation. The bloom is infectious. It's taken Reed. Secure your sections and be on the lookout for any signs of infection. Dark marks on the skin, black eyes. Avoid contact at all costs. Pulse rifles are ineffective. Try sonic emitters if you have them. And be aware that it seems to be able to interface with our implants." Back in the lab, Morris and I worked to stabilize Grant. We used the medical bay's advanced diagnostic tools, and I donned the medical exoskeleton, the robotic frame augmenting my strength and precision as I worked to stop the bleeding. A frantic message came through my implant. It was 2 crew members stationed in the geothermal power plant, their voices panicked. "They're acting strange. All of them. The black stuff. It's on their skin." The message was cut short by a scream followed by static. "They're in the power plant," I said to Morris, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. "If the bloom compromises the reactor, we're all dead." The implications sank in. We needed to regain control of the plant. "It's spreading too fast," Morris said, his voice filled with despair. "We need to contain it." "Ventilation system," I muttered, a chilling realization dawning on me. It must be airborne. I quickly accessed the outpost's control panel and initiated a complete lockdown of the ventilation system. Hopefully, it wasn't too late. As we worked, Dr. Grant's condition deteriorated rapidly. The black growth spread across his body, engulfing him. Despite our best efforts, he succumbed, his body convulsing one last time before falling still. The light vanished from his eyes. They were as black as reeds. "Kent to Lennox," a voice came through my implant. "We need backup at the power plant. They're everywhere." The desperation in his voice was evident. "Use EMP grenades," I authorized, knowing it was a long shot. "And be careful, Kent. Don't get close to them." Morris and I donned our environmental suits. The suits were our lifelines that allowed us to survive the brutal conditions of Triton. Each suit was equipped with an integrated heads-up display, providing real-time information on oxygen levels, temperature, and other vital data. It also housed our communication system, now distressingly silent, save for the static from the ongoing solar interference, or whatever it was. We made our way to the geothermal power plant. The plant was eerily quiet. The massive turbines, which usually spun with a mesmerizing grace, were stationary, their surfaces reflecting the emergency lighting. We moved cautiously, our pulse rifles held at the ready, the beams of our helmet lights cutting through the gloom, revealing nothing but cold, unyielding metal. We found the first bodies near the main control room. 2 technicians, their environmental suits torn open, their bodies covered in the black growth. It had completely enveloped their faces, obscuring their features. Their necks were twisted. One was slumped over in a chair, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The other was on the floor near an auxiliary exit, his hand outstretched as if reaching for something. It was clear they hadn't stood a chance. Further in, we found Dr. Kent and his team. They were engaged in a firefight with a group of infected crew members, the blue flashes of pulse rifle fire illuminating the chaotic scene. The infected seemed to shrug off the energy blasts. A discarded sonic emitter lay on the floor near one of the fallen security officers, its casing cracked and sparking. It was clear that the security team was overwhelmed. Morris and I joined the fray, firing our pulse rifles at the approaching infected. The blue energy beams struck them, but they kept coming, their bodies twitching and contorting. One of them, an engineer whose name I couldn't recall, slammed into Kent, knocking him off his feet. The engineer raised a mangled piece of the reactor housing, about to bring it down on Kent's helmet. I fired. The blast struck the engineer in the back, staggering him, but he didn't fall. Roaring, he spun to face me, his features contorted by the encroaching black veins, his eyes now bottomless pits of darkness. Morris fired again and again, hitting the infected engineer multiple times. Finally, with a shudder, the engineer collapsed, his body convulsing on the floor. But it was too late for Kent. Another infected crew member, a technician I recognized as Williams, was on him, his enhanced strength evident as he rained blows upon him. He slammed a heavy emergency power cell down on Kent's helmet, crushing it. We managed to subdue the remaining infected, using a combination of pulse rifle fire and a sonic emitter that Morris had recovered. It was a costly victory. 3 more security personnel were dead, their bodies added to the growing list of casualties. The outpost's security force was decimated. I knelt beside Kent's body, my hand resting on his crushed helmet. His death was a heavy blow. He was a good man, a steady presence in this increasingly unstable environment. Now he was just another victim of the bloom. I felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a wave of exhaustion. We were losing, badly. Back in the lab, I continued my analysis of the bloom sample we'd retrieved earlier, before Reed's transformation. I focused the high-powered microscope on a section of the fungal tissue, magnifying it to its maximum resolution. I adjusted the wavelength of the laser, scanning for changes in the bloom's structure. I ran a diagnostic on its chemical composition, comparing it to the initial scans we'd taken when we first discovered it. It was evolving at an alarming rate. What I saw next sent a chill down my spine. The bloom's cellular structure was reorganizing, forming new, complex patterns. It was actively responding to the electrical impulses from the microscope. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. The bloom's veins were extending towards the small access port on the microscope, the one designed for interfacing with external devices, including neural implants. I quickly cross-referenced the bloom's activity with Reed's medical scans, taken moments before he lost control. The correlation was undeniable. The bloom's activity spiked in direct response to Reed's neural activity. It wasn't just a passive infection, it was actively interfacing with his implant, accessing his neural pathways. The bloom wasn't just controlling its host's motor functions. It was accessing their memories, their knowledge, their very identities. It was evolving, becoming more dangerous with each passing moment. Each new host provided it with more data, more understanding of human physiology and psychology. A wave of dizziness washed over me, my hand instinctively going to my temple, to my own implant. I felt a sudden sharp pain, a throbbing sensation that emanated from the implant itself. My implant felt unusually warm. Was the bloom trying to get in? To infiltrate my mind as well? "It's in your head, Arthur," a voice said, startling me. I turned to see Dr. Morris standing behind me, his eyes wide with fear and suspicion. He was holding his pulse rifle, his hands shaking. "You brought this upon us. You're one of them." "Morris, it's me," I said, trying to remain calm. "The bloom is trying to manipulate us, don't you see?" But my words seemed to have the opposite effect. His grip on the rifle tightened. "Liar!" he hissed. "I saw you talking to yourself. You're infected." He raised the rifle, aiming it at me. I saw the fear in his eyes, the paranoia that had consumed him. The bloom was twisting his mind, turning him against me. He was seeing a monster where a colleague stood. "Morris, put the gun down," I pleaded. "We need to work together. We can still stop this." He fired. The blue energy beam grazed my left arm, searing my flesh. I cried out in pain, stumbling backward. The pain was intense, a burning sensation that ran up my arm. I could see a red, glowing line where the beam had hit me. I scrambled for cover, diving behind a lab table as Morris fired again. The energy blasts impacted the table, sending sparks flying. I managed to disarm him, tackling him to the ground. We wrestled for a moment, the pulse rifle clattering across the floor. I subdued him, using a sedative from the medical kit to knock him out. He slumped to the floor, unconscious. I secured him to a chair with restraints, my heart heavy with a sense of profound isolation. Morris, my colleague, my friend, had tried to kill me. The bloom had turned him into an enemy. I was the only one left. Everyone else was either dead or had become a puppet of the bloom. I examined my arm. The burn was shallow, but it required care. I applied a medic gel patch, the cool gel easing the pain. I returned to the computer, determined to find a way to stop the bloom. I reviewed the data again, searching for any weakness, any vulnerability. The bloom was intelligent, adaptable, and incredibly dangerous. It had turned a scientific discovery into a nightmare. I discovered something even more disturbing. The bloom wasn't just spreading through the outpost. It was trying to access the communication array. It wasn't trying to send itself, not physically, but it was trying to transmit something. Corrupted data, I realized. False information about the bloom, perhaps even commands designed to sabotage other outposts or, even more terrifyingly, to influence neural implants. The implications were terrifying. If this corrupted data reached Earth, or even other outposts with less robust security, it could incite panic, sabotage critical systems, or even turn people against each other. It was sending instructions to other implants, making them seek out its location. The communication blackout, I realized, was no accident. It was either a deliberate act by the bloom, a consequence of its initial attempt to manipulate the data stream, or by Vanguard Interstellar, a desperate attempt to contain the situation to keep their potential bioweapon hidden. It didn't matter which. The result was the same. We were cut off, alone, with no way to properly warn anyone. I made a decision. I activated the outpost's emergency beacon, a powerful signal designed to be detected by any nearby vessels or outposts. It was a risk. There was a chance that it could attract help, but the signal itself might be corrupted, potentially luring rescuers into a trap or spreading the bloom's influence further. But I couldn't just sit here and wait to die. I had to do something. I had to warn them, even if it was just a basic distress call. The realization that I was truly alone was a heavy blow. Morris, my last remaining colleague, was now a puppet of the bloom, a threat, just like the others. The outpost had become a hunting ground, with me as the prey. The bloom, through its infected hosts, controlled most of the outpost's systems. Cameras, doors, even the automated turrets, all were potential threats, extensions of the alien intelligence that was slowly consuming everything. I moved cautiously through the corridors, sticking to the less-traveled maintenance routes, avoiding the main thoroughfares. Every flickering light, every creak of the outpost's structure sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was constantly on edge, my senses on high alert. I armed myself with a pulse rifle, a sonic emitter, and a handful of EMP grenades. These were meager tools against the growing threat, but they were all I had. The infected were not mindless zombies. They were coordinated, their movements purposeful, driven by the Bloom's alien intelligence. They moved through the outpost, their black eyes scanning for any sign of their prey. Me. They were relentless, tireless, and utterly devoid of humanity. I set traps, using my knowledge of the outpost's layout and its systems to my advantage. I rerouted power conduits, creating temporary electrical barriers. I used motion sensors to trigger alarms, hoping to disorient or distract the infected. I even managed to jury-rig a few automated cleaning bots to act as decoys, their movements drawing the attention of the infected while I slipped past unnoticed. But the infected began to anticipate my moves, cutting off my escape routes, setting ambushes. They disabled the cameras I was using to monitor their movements. They herded me, like an animal, towards areas of the outpost that were more difficult to defend. One close encounter sent me scrambling for my life. I was in a narrow corridor, trying to reach the cryostasis chamber, when two infected engineers cornered me. They had fashioned crude blades from salvaged metal, likely scavenged from maintenance panels. I fired my pulse rifle, hitting one in the chest. He stumbled but kept coming. The other rushed me, his makeshift blade a jagged piece of sharpened metal, held like a dagger. I ducked, the blade narrowly missing my neck, scraping against the wall with a shower of sparks. I rolled away, firing again and again. The energy blasts struck the infected, but they seemed to absorb the impacts, their bodies contorting but not breaking. I was running out of energy. My rifle was almost depleted. In desperation, I fumbled for an EMP grenade, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. The two engineers were almost upon me. I ripped the grenade from my belt, and with a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening in this frozen wasteland, I hurled it at their feet. The small device detonated with a flash of blue light, releasing a powerful electromagnetic pulse. The effect was immediate. The infected engineers convulsed, their movements becoming jerky. It wasn't paralysis, not exactly. The EMP had disrupted the Bloom's control over their nervous systems, interfering with the signals passing between the fungal mass and their host bodies. Their implants, it seemed, were particularly vulnerable. I scrambled to my feet and fled, the image of their black eyes burned into my mind. That was too close. I needed a new strategy. I reached the cryostasis chamber, a small circular room housing 6 cryopods, designed for long-duration space travel or emergency medical situations. The pods were metallic cylinders, each equipped with a transparent canopy that revealed the empty interior. I considered entering one of the pods. It was tempting to simply shut down, to escape the nightmare, even if only temporarily. But I knew that it was a fool's hope. The Bloom would still be there, waiting when I emerged. And there was no guarantee that anyone would ever come to rescue me. The emergency beacon was a long shot at best. No, I couldn't give up. I was the only one who knew the truth about the Bloom, the only one who could stop it from spreading beyond Triton. I had a responsibility, a duty to destroy it, even if it meant sacrificing myself. I accessed the outpost's central computer. My goal was to overload the geothermal reactor, to trigger a meltdown that would obliterate the outpost and everything in it, including the Bloom. It was a drastic measure, a suicide mission, but I saw no other way. As I worked, I heard the telltale sounds of the infected approaching. They were coming for me, drawn by the Bloom's insidious awareness. I had to hurry. Suddenly, the door to the cryostasis chamber opened, and there stood Morris. He was fully under the Bloom's control now, the black growth covering his entire body. He was no longer the Morris I knew. He was a monster, a weapon of the Bloom. He charged at me, his movements faster, stronger than before. The bloom had enhanced him, turning him into a formidable predator. I raised my pulse rifle, but it was empty. The energy cell was depleted. I cursed, throwing the useless weapon aside. Morris was on me, his hands reaching for my throat. I dodged, narrowly avoiding his grasp. We grappled, struggling for control. He was incredibly strong, his grip like iron. I managed to break free, kicking him in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. I scanned the room, desperate for a weapon. Near the doorway that led to the reactor, I spotted a discarded geothermal drill bit, its tip glinting under the emergency lights. It was heavy, designed to bore through rock and ice, but I hefted it. We circled each other, our eyes locked in a deadly dance. He was toying with me, I realized. The bloom was enjoying this, the thrill of the hunt. He attacked again, his movements precise, faster than any normal human could achieve. I thrust the drill bit forward like a spear, the sharpened tip aimed at his chest. He twisted his body, avoiding the main thrust, but the tip of the bit grazed his arm, tearing through his environmental suit and ripping into his flesh. He howled, a chilling sound that was both animalistic and filled with rage. He lunged, swiping at me with his good arm, but I anticipated the blow. I dropped to one knee, narrowly avoiding his grasp. The drill bit was heavy, awkward, but I swung it upwards in a desperate arc, connecting with his other arm. This time it was worse than a graze. The drill bit tore through flesh and bone. He screamed again, this time in agony. He was losing too much blood. Black ichor sprayed from the wounds. The fight was far from over, but I had a small window of opportunity. I scrambled back, putting distance between us. I couldn't risk another close-quarters encounter. He was still too strong, even injured. I needed to escape to reach the reactor controls. I turned and fled, heading towards the exit that led to the reactor core, leaving the injured and enraged Morris behind. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps echoing in the corridor, his enraged roars fueling my desperate flight. He was coming after me, but he was slower now, hampered by his injuries. Every step was agony for him. But I knew he wouldn't stop. The bloom wouldn't let him. The system required a manual override, a final failsafe that could only be activated from within the reactor core itself. It was a suicide mission. There was no way to survive activating the override from within the reactor. Alarms blared, and the outpost's automated voice announced the impending meltdown. I made my way to the reactor room, the heart of the outpost. The room was large and circular, dominated by the massive geothermal reactor in the center. It was a towering structure of metal and pipes. It was usually a comforting sight, the source of our power, our lifeblood. Now it was a ticking time bomb. I reached the reactor controls, my body battered and bruised, my environmental suit torn in several places. The heat from the reactor was intense, almost unbearable. My suit's internal temperature gauge was rising rapidly. I initiated the manual override, the final step in the meltdown sequence. A large, red button protected by a transparent cover. The system required a final confirmation, a physical key that had to be inserted and turned. I held the key, a simple, almost archaic device in this age of advanced technology. Yet, it held the fate of Outpost Kepler, of Triton, and perhaps all of humanity in its metallic form. The transparent cover over the red button seemed to mock me, a thin barrier between a horrific end and an even more horrific salvation. The reactor core radiated with an almost unbearable energy, the heat searing through my environmental suit. My suit's internal temperature gauge was flashing, a constant, urgent warning. I inserted the key into the slot, my movements precise despite the tremors that shook my body. The key turned with a heavy mechanical click, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the roaring chaos. The red button glowed, a malevolent eye staring back at me. I paused for a fraction of a second, my mind filled with a whirlwind of thoughts, of regrets, of faces of those I had lost. Then I thought of my father. Not as the hollow shell he had become in his final days, but as I remembered him from my childhood. Strong, vibrant, his eyes full of life and laughter. He was a pioneer, a man who had dedicated his life to unlocking the secrets of the human mind. He would have understood the choice I was making. He would have made the same one. With a deep breath, I pressed the button. The effect was instantaneous. A surge of power coursed through the reactor, the already intense heat reaching an unimaginable level. My suit's alarms screamed, warning me of critical radiation levels, of imminent structural failure. The outpost began to shake violently, metal groaning and cracking under the strain. I stumbled, grabbing onto a railing for support as the floor bucked and heaved. This was it. There was no turning back. As the reactor reached critical mass, the fear, the adrenaline, the pain, all faded away, replaced by a profound sense of peace. It was as if my mind, freed from the constraints of the physical world, was finally at rest. In that final moment of clarity, I saw my father. He stood before me, not as a ghost or a hallucination, but as a real, tangible presence. He was, as I remembered him in his prime, his eyes sparkling with intelligence and warmth, a kind smile on his face. He reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of understanding, of pride. "It's all right, Arthur," he said, his voice a soothing balm in the roaring chaos. "You did good, son. You did good." And then there was only light. A blinding flash of energy, brighter than 1,000 suns, erupted from the heart of the geothermal reactor. The explosion ripped through Outpost Kepler, consuming everything in its path. The reinforced polymer walls, the advanced technology, the remnants of the bloom, the bodies of the infected, all were vaporized in an instant. The shockwave expanded outward, a sphere of pure energy that obliterated everything within a 5-mile radius, leaving behind a vast, smoldering crater in the icy surface of Triton. The emergency beacon, which had been transmitting its desperate signal for days, abruptly cut out, its message silenced forever. Triton, once again, was a desolate, lifeless world, its secrets buried beneath the ice.